The church bells rang softly, casting a sense of calm over the crowd gathered inside. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the aisle in hues of red, green, and blue. All eyes turned toward the bride as she stood at the entrance, her white gown shimmering like fresh snow. She clutched her bouquet tightly, her heart pounding with excitement. Today was supposed to be perfect, a day she had dreamed of since childhood. At her side walked her loyal German shepherd, Max, wearing a tiny bow tie. People chuckled and admired the sit-it. Wasn't every day you saw a dog walk down the aisle at a wedding, but for her, Max was family. The groom, standing at the altar, smiled broadly as his eyes locked with hers. He looked handsome in his black tuxedo, and the love in his gaze steadied her nerves. The priest stood behind him, holding a small velvet box that contained the rings. Everything seemed perfect. Music swelled softly as the bride made her way down the aisle, Max trotting proudly beside her. Guests whispered about how adorable it was, how unique this wedding felt. Finally, she reached the altar. The groom took her hands gently, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The priest opened his book, his voice calm yet oddly strained as he began reciting the vows. The bride barely noticed. Her focus was on the man she loved. But Max noticed. His ears perked up slightly, his body stiffening as if sensing something in the air. The priest continued, though his hands trembled ever so slightly as he held the ring. His eyes flicked nervously around the room, settling briefly on the large dog before returning to the book. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead despite the coolness of the church. The bride noticed this now. Why did he look so uneasy? She brushed the thought aside. It was just nerves, she told herself. After all, officiating weddings could be emotional too, right? Do you, Emily, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? The priest asked, voice cracking slightly at the end. She smiled through her tears. I do, she whispered. The crowd sighed happily. Then came the next part. The priest reached for the ring box, his hands trembling more visibly now. The groom smiled, waiting to slide the ring onto her finger. That's when it happened. Max suddenly barked loud and sharp, cutting through the calm like a gunshot. Everyone jumped. The bride spun toward her dog in shock. Max's teeth were bared slightly, his body tense, eyes locked on the priest. A second bark, followed, deeper and more commanding, as if warning everyone in the room. Gasps echoed through the church. The priest froze, his face draining of color. His hand jerked, and the velvet box slipped from his fingers, crashing to the floor. The rings rolled across the polished wood like tiny wheels of fate. Then, without a word, the priest turned and bolted. He ran down the aisle, nearly tripping over the hem of his robe, shoving startled guests aside as he sprinted toward the exit. Chaos erupted. The bride stood frozen, gripping the groom's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. People shouted in confusion, some running after the priest, others trying to calm the growing panic. Max barked again, pulling at his leash, straining toward the door, as if determined to chase. What the hell just happened? The groom muttered, his voice shaking. Emily couldn't answer. Her mind raced. Why would a priest flee in the middle of a wedding? And why did Max bark like that? She knelt down, holding her dog's face, looking into his intelligent eyes. He whined softly, then turned his head toward the door, ears pinned back. He wasn't barking out of excitement. It was fear, warning. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance. Police cars screeched to a stop outside the church, lights flashing red and blue through the stained glass. Officers rushed in, weapons drawn, ordering everyone to stay calm. The bride's stomach dropped as two officers approached her. "Ma'am, where's the priest?" one asked urgently. Emily pointed toward the doors, still trying to process everything. He ran out. Why? What's going on? The officer exchanged a grim look with his partner. That man isn't a priest. His real name is Victor Hale. He's been on the run for 2 years, armed robbery, fraud, and suspected murder. We've been tracking him, but he kept changing his identity. Looks like he was hiding in plain sight. Emily's knees buckled, and she grabbed the pew for support. Her wedding day had just turned into a nightmare. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He was right here, standing with us, marrying us." Max barked again, pulling toward the door, eager to chase. The officers quickly followed his lead. "Let the dog come with us," one said. "He might track him down faster than we can." The leash was unclipped, and Max shot out like a bullet, his paws pounding against the marble floor. The bride and groom clung to each other, their perfect day unraveling into something they'd only seen in movies. Minutes later, gunshots echoed faintly in the distance, sending a chill through the crowd. Emily's heart stopped, but then an officer's voice came over the radio, calm and firm. "Suspect apprehended." Thanks to the dog, relief washed over her like a tidal wave. When Max returned, his tongue hanging out and his tail wagging, the entire church erupted in applause. Emily dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "You've saved my life," she whispered into his fur. If Max hadn't barked, she would have married a man with blood on his hands, a fugitive hiding under the guise of holiness. The wedding resumed hours later, though in a smaller room at the reception hall, with a new officiant brought in by the police. There were no flowers left, no grand aisle, no church bells, but Emily didn't care. She had the man she loved, and by her side, the hero who made sure she'd live to see another day. When they said "I do" this time, Max sat proudly at their feet, the bow tie slightly crooked, his chest puffed out like he knew he was the real guardian of the day. As champagne glasses clinked and laughter filled the room, Emily glanced at her dog with gratitude swelling in her heart. She realized something that day: sometimes fate speaks softly, and sometimes it barks loudly enough to save your life. The sky was a flawless blue, and the scent of roses lingered in the warm summer air. Emily stood in front of a tall mirror in the bridal suite, her heart racing as she adjusted the veil cascading down her back. Today was the day she had been waiting for, a day filled with love, laughter, and the promise of forever. Her German shepherd, Max, sat loyally at her side, his amber eyes watching her every move, as if guarding her from unseen dangers. She smiled, patting his head. "You're my lucky charm, Max," she whispered. The wedding venue was a charming, old church with wooden pews and stained glass windows that painted the floor in kaleidoscopic colors. Guests were already seated, their whispers echoing softly through the vaulted ceiling. At the altar, the groom waited in a sleek black tuxedo, smiling every time he caught sight of her shadow moving behind the curtain. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. Emily took a deep breath as the music started. Her father held her arm, and with Max trotting proudly beside them, they walked down the aisle. The congregation gasped and smiled at the sight of the big dog in a little bow tie. Phones clicked, capturing the unusual yet heartwarming moment. Emily didn't care what anyone thought. Max had been with her through heartbreak and joy, and there was no way she would leave him behind today. As they reached the altar, the priest greeted them with a polite nod. He was an older man with grey hair and kind eyes, or at least, that's what Emily thought at first glance. But as she looked closer, something about him seemed off. His hands trembled as he opened his book. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, even though the church was cool. Emily frowned slightly, wondering if he was nervous. The vows began, and the room filled with the hum of anticipation. The priest's voice wavered slightly as he read, his tone unusually stiff. Emily noticed he kept glancing toward the back door. Every few seconds, her stomach tightened. Was he expecting someone? Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The priest reached into his pocket and carefully pulled out a small velvet box. Inside were the rings, two simple bands that represented a lifetime of love. He opened the box with shaky fingers, his breath hitching as he handed the groom the first ring. Emily smiled, trying to shake off the unease crawling through her chest. That's when Max growled. It wasn't a playful sound. It was deep, guttural, a warning that made the hair on the back of Emily's neck stand up. The dog's eyes were locked on the priest, his muscles coiled like springs. Emily tightened her grip on the leash. "Max, no," she whispered. But the German shepherd wasn't listening. The priest's hand froze mid-air, the ring trembling between his fingers. His face turned pale as he stared at the dog, his lips parting in shock. Then Max barked loud and sharp, the sound exploding in the stillness like a gunshot. Guests gasped, some flinching, others murmuring nervously. The priest's composure shattered. His eyes darted wildly around the room, and before anyone could react, he dropped the ring. It clattered onto the wooden floor, rolling under a pew. Then, without a word, the priest spun around and bolted toward the side door. Gasps turned to screams as he shoved past startled guests, his robe flapping behind him like wings. Emily's heart pounded so hard it hurt. She clutched her groom's arm, her voice trembling. What just happened? Chaos erupted. Guests stood up, some chasing after the fleeing priest, others trying to calm Max, who was barking furiously now, lunging against the leash. The groom ran a hand through his hair, his jaw clenched. Why would he just run like that? Emily didn't answer because, deep down, she already knew it wasn't Max who overreacted. It was the priest who had something to hide. Minutes later, the sound of sirens shattered the uneasy quiet. Police cars pulled up outside, lights flashing. Against the stained glass, 2 officers stormed in, scanning the room. "Where's the priest?" one barked. Emily pointed with a trembling hand toward the door he had escaped through. The officer cursed under his breath. "He's not a priest. His name is Charles Denton. He's on the FBI's most wanted list for attempted murder and armed robbery." Emily felt her knees weaken. "What?" the officer continued grimly. "We've been tracking him for months. He assumed fake identities to hide, and it looks like he planned something big today." Emily's mind reeled. Planned something. Her eyes darted to the ring box lying on the floor. The officer followed her gaze, then knelt and picked it up. Slowly, he opened the box and froze. Inside, the padding had been hollowed out, concealing a tiny vial of clear liquid. The officer's voice was grim. "Poison, strong enough to kill in seconds." Emily staggered back, horror gripping her chest. He was going to poison the wine during the ceremony. Her wedding, the happiest day of her life, was about to become a death trap. Max whined softly, pressing against her leg as if sensing her fear. She dropped to her knees, hugging him tightly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You saved us," she whispered into his fur. Without that bark, she might not have lived to see the end of the day. Outside, a shout erupted. Officers returned, moments later with the fugitive in handcuffs, his face twisted in rage. Max growled low, teeth bared, as if daring him to try anything. The officer nodded toward the dog. "Good instincts. That German shepherd is a hero." Hours later, the wedding resumed quietly in a small room at the reception hall. The decorations were gone, the music silent, but Emily didn't care. She had her groom, and by her side, the dog who risked everything for her. When she finally said, "I do," Max lay at her feet, his head resting on her gown. His eyes calm now that the danger had passed. As champagne glasses clinked and laughter slowly returned. Emily looked at Max and whispered, "You're more than family. You're my guardian angel." And deep down she knew the truth. Sometimes love isn't just about the people who promise to protect you. Sometimes it's about the dog who already has. The lake shimmered under the golden afternoon sun, reflecting the soft hues of the summer sky. The wedding venue looked like something out of a fairy tale, a sprawling green lawn, dotted with white chairs and delicate floral arches. Emily stood at the edge of it all, dressed in a flowing white gown, the train cascading like a river of silk behind her. Her heart pounded with anticipation, but her smile glowed with love. Today, she would marry the man who had stood by her side through thick and thin. At her feet sat Max, her German shepherd, wearing a tiny bow tie around his muscular neck. Guests smiled and whispered about how adorable he looked, but Emily didn't care about their chatter. Max wasn't just a pet, he was family, a protector, and her only constant after her parents' tragic deaths years ago. "Ready, Max?" she whispered, stroking his fur as the wedding music began to play. He wagged his tail once, but his amber eyes stayed sharp, scanning the crowd. Emily stepped onto the grassy aisle, her father on one side, Max on the other. The murmurs of admiration rose louder as they approached the altar where her groom stood, his face lighting up the moment he saw her. Behind him, the priest waited, his long robe flowing in the gentle breeze. He looked older, with silver hair and deep lines etched into his face, his hands folded over a small prayer book. There was something familiar about him, though Emily couldn't place it. She brushed off the thought. This was her wedding, nothing could spoil it. As she reached the altar, Max sat obediently at her feet, though his ears were perked forward, his body rigid. Emily barely noticed. The priest began to speak, his voice deep and solemn, though oddly strained. He fumbled with the book once before steadying it in his hands. Emily noticed his knuckles were white from gripping it so tightly. The vows began, and the warm air buzzed with joy. Emily's heart swelled as she said, "I do," her voice trembling with emotion. The priest nodded slowly and turned to the groom, asking him the same. But as the words hung in the air, Max shifted. His tail stopped moving, his lips curling back slightly, exposing sharp white teeth. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that sliced through the calm like a blade. Emily's breath caught. "Max," she whispered under her breath, tugging gently at the leash. But the dog's gaze was locked on the priest, unblinking, cold. The groom answered, his voice strong. "I do too." The guests clapped softly, smiling. The priest nodded again and bent down to pick up the ring box resting on the altar table. His hands shook so badly that the box slipped, clattering to the wooden platform. He cursed under his breath, a sharp, ugly sound that didn't belong in a sacred ceremony. Emily's eyes widened, her unease growing. Before she could process it, Max barked loud and feral, his entire body lunging forward like a coiled spring unleashed. The sound was so sudden, so violent, that guests gasped, chairs scraping as people stumbled back in panic. The priest froze, the color draining from his face. His eyes darted wildly around as if searching for an escape. Then, without warning, he bolted. He spun on his heel and sprinted down the aisle, shoving guests aside, his robe whipping behind him like a shadow fleeing the light. Emily stood rooted in shock, her bouquet falling from her hands. "What is going on?" she cried, as chaos erupted around her. Max barked again, pulling so hard on the leash that it burned her palms. He wanted to chase, to drag the man down. The groom grabbed her arm. "Emily, what the hell just happened?" She couldn't answer because in that split second, it clicked. That face, those eyes, memories she had buried deep clawed their way to the surface the night her parents died in a car crash that wasn't an accident. The mysterious stranger at the funeral who stared too long, the voice she overheard making threats. And now, here he was, standing as a priest at her wedding. The sound of sirens shattered the tension. Police cars screeched to a halt outside the venue, officers pouring in, guns drawn. One of them rushed toward Emily, his expression grim. "Where's the man in the priest's robe?" Emily pointed with a shaking hand toward the path leading into the woods. "He ran that way." "What's going on?" The officer cursed. "That man's name is Victor Kane. He's wanted for multiple homicides, including a hit-and-run years ago. He's been hiding for over a decade, using fake identities. We got a tip, he might be here, but we were too late." Emily's throat tightened, her vision blurring with tears. A hit-and-run 10 years ago, her parents. It all made sense now. The reason Max had growled wasn't random dogs never forget scents. Max was just a puppy when her parents died. But he must have remembered. He recognized the smell of the man who took everything from her. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the grass, clutching Max like a lifeline. "You knew," she whispered, tears soaking his fur. "You saved me. You always saved me." Minutes later, a shout echoed from the woods. Officers dragged the priest back in handcuffs, his face twisted with rage and something else, fear. Max growled low, his eyes burning into the man as if daring him to move. The officer turned to Emily. "You're lucky, ma'am. That dog just exposed a killer. If he hadn't panicked and fled, your wedding could have turned into something far worse." Emily shivered, her mind spinning with what-ifs. She looked at Max, her heart overflowing with gratitude and love. This wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was a day when the past clawed its way into the present, only to be stopped by the one creature who had always watched over her. The ceremony resumed hours later, in a small hall, stripped of grandeur but overflowing with emotion. Emily and her groom held hands as they whispered their vows, Max lying at their feet like a silent sentinel. When the officiant finally said, "You may kiss the bride," cheers erupted, louder than ever before, not just for love, but for survival. As Emily kissed her husband, her gaze drifted to Max. His tail wagged slowly, his eyes calm now that the danger was gone. She smiled through her tears. "You're not just my dog," she whispered under her breath. "You're my hero." And as the night sky spread its blanket of stars over the quiet lake, Emily knew one truth would stay with her forever. Sometimes, the fiercest love doesn't come in human form. It comes with fur, sharp instincts, and a bark that saves lives. The sun filtered gently through the stained glass windows of the old cathedral, casting a rainbow of colors on the polished floor. Guests filled the pews, whispering with excitement as the music began to play. Emily took a deep breath, clutching her bouquet as her father adjusted her veil. She felt like a dream in her white gown, but her heart wasn't entirely calm. Something inside her churned an odd unease that had nothing to do with wedding jitters. Beside her sat Max, her loyal German shepherd, wearing a black bow tie that made him look like a noble guardian. His calm presence usually soothed her, But today, even Max seemed unusually alert. His amber eyes scanned the aisle as if searching for danger. Emily bent down and stroked his head. "It's okay, boy," she whispered. But Max didn't take his eyes off the altar. The groom waited there, looking handsome in his tailored suit, his face glowing with love. Standing next to him was the priest, a tall man in his late 50s with a stern face and cold, watchful eyes. Emily noticed his hands fidgeting slightly as he clutched a small velvet box. Maybe he was nervous, she thought, or maybe. The music swelled, and Emily began her walk down the aisle. Guests turned, smiling at the unusual yet heartwarming sight of the bride walking with her German shepherd. The cameras clicked, capturing what everyone thought was a perfect moment. No one knew how quickly perfection could shatter. As Emily reached the altar, Max sat beside her, his body tense like a coiled spring. The priest cleared his throat and began the vows in a deep, monotone voice that sounded almost impatient. His eyes flicked to the clock on the wall, then to the doors at the back of the church. Emily frowned slightly. Was he waiting for someone? "Do you, Emily, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the priest asked. "I do," she whispered, smiling through tears. The priest turned to the groom, repeating the question. He answered with pride, "I do." The guests sighed happily. The priest gave a stiff nod, then bent to pick up the ring box from the table beside him. His fingers trembled as he opened it, revealing 2 golden bands. That's when Max growled. It wasn't loud at first, just a low, menacing rumble that sent a chill through Emily's spine. She tugged the leash gently, whispering, "Max, stop." But the dog ignored her. His ears were pinned back, his body rigid, eyes locked on the priest like a predator eyeing its prey. Before anyone could react, Max barked sharp, deafening, echoing through the cathedral like a gunshot. Guests gasped, some standing in shock. The priest froze, his face draining of color. The box slipped from his hands, the rings rolling across the floor. Then he ran. It happened so fast, Emily barely registered it. 1 second he was standing before her, and the next he was shoving past the groom, bolting down the aisle toward the back door. His robe flew behind him like dark wings, his footsteps pounding against the marble floor. Chaos erupted as guests screamed, some trying to follow, others shielding the bride. Emily clutched her chest, her heart slamming against her ribs. "What is happening?" she cried. Max lunged forward, dragging her a few steps before she tightened her grip. He barked furiously, straining to chase the man. His instincts were screaming louder than any words could. Moments later, the sharp wail of sirens pierced the air outside. 2 police officers burst through the doors, their guns drawn. "Everyone stay where you are," one shouted. His eyes scanned the crowd, landing on Emily. "Where's the man in the priest's robe?" Emily pointed shakily toward the side. "Exit." He ran out. "What's going on?" The officer's jaw tightened. That wasn't a priest. His name's Alan Royce. He's been on the run for months, wanted for smuggling and armed robbery. We had a tip he'd be here, but he glanced at the ring box on the floor, his eyes narrowing. Emily's stomach twisted as the officer knelt and pried open the box. Inside wasn't just velvet padding. Hidden in a false compartment was a small pouch filled with glittering diamonds. The officer held it up grimly. "Stolen, worth millions. He was using your wedding as a cover to make a drop." Emily felt her knees weaken. She grabbed the groom's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "He was going to, what? Use us?" The officer nodded grimly. "And if anything went wrong, he wouldn't hesitate to kill witnesses. You're lucky your dog reacted when he did." As if on cue, Max let out a short bark. His chest puffed out proudly. Emily dropped to her knees, hugging him tightly as tears spilled down her cheeks. "You saved us," she whispered into his fur. Guests began to clap softly, relief washing over the room like a wave. The officers sprinted toward the parking lot, and within minutes, the sound of a struggle erupted outside. Alan Royce was dragged back in handcuffs, his face twisted in fury. Max snarled low, teeth bared as the man passed by. The officer gave the dog an approving nod. "Smart animal." If it weren't for him, this could have ended very differently. Hours later, the wedding resumed, but not in the grandeur of the cathedral. They moved to a small private hall, stripped of flowers and music, but filled with something more precious: safety. Emily and her groom exchanged vows in whispers, hands trembling as they slid the rings onto each other's fingers. At their feet, Max lay calmly, his head resting on his paws. as if nothing had happened. When the officiant finally said, "You may kiss the bride," cheers erupted, not just for love, but for survival, for the instinct that turned a day of danger into a story they would never forget. Emily kissed her husband, then turned to Max, her voice breaking as she whispered, "You're not just part of my wedding, Max. You're the reason I'm alive to have one." The dog wagged his tail, eyes shining with quiet pride. And as the night deepened, Emily realized something she would carry forever sometimes. The truest guardian doesn't wear a badge or hold a gun. Sometimes it walks on four legs, with a heart big enough to save the world you love. The wedding hall glowed under the soft light of chandeliers, every detail meticulously arranged to make the day perfect. Emily stood in front of a tall mirror, adjusting her veil with trembling hands. Her heart pounded, a mixture of excitement and nerves. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, a celebration of love, commitment, and trust. Beside her sat Max, her German shepherd, wearing a black bow tie that made him look regal. He had been her protector since college, the one constant presence through every storm. She knelt and hugged him tightly, burying her face in his fur. "Promise me you'll behave." "Okay," she whispered. Max licked her cheek once, but didn't wag his tail. His amber eyes seemed sharper than usual, scanning the room as though sensing something Emily couldn't. When the music began, she stepped out, her father holding her arm. Guests turned and gasped at the sight of her radiant in white, walking with her loyal companion. Max trotted beside her like a soldier escorting a queen. The groom waited at the altar, his face glowing with joy, and behind him stood the priest, tall and solemn, draped in traditional robes. Emily's eyes met the priest's briefly, and something inside her hesitated. His face looked vaguely familiar, but she brushed the thought away. Maybe he'd officiated a friend's wedding before. Nothing to worry about, or so she thought. As she reached the altar, Max sat by her feet. The ceremony began. The priest's voice was deep, steady, almost too formal, like he was reading from a script rather than speaking from the heart. Emily noticed his hands tremble slightly as he turned the pages of the book. When their eyes met again, a flicker of something dark crossed his gaze, making her skin prickle. Still, the vows went on. The groom smiled as he said, "I do," his voice strong and confident. Emily's heart swelled with love, and when it was her turn, she whispered the same words. Guests sighed in relief and joy. That then came the moment of the rings. The priest reached into his robe and pulled out a velvet box. Emily noticed his hand shaking, not the nervous tremor of an old man, but a jittery twitch that screamed tension. He opened the box slowly, almost reluctantly, revealing two golden bands that gleamed in the candlelight. That's when Max growled. The sound was low and dangerous, vibrating through the silence like a warning bell. Emily froze, her heart skipping. "A beat, Max," she hissed under her breath, tugging at his leash, but the dog ignored her. His entire body stiffened, his eyes locked on the priest with a ferocity she had never seen before. Before anyone could react, Max barked a sharp, thunderous sound that sent a shiver down every spine in the room. Guests gasped, some flinching. In alarm, the priest jerked violently, the box slipping from his fingers. The rings clattered to the floor, rolling under the altar. Then, in a move that stunned everyone, the priest turned and bolted. He shoved past the groom, his robe swirling behind him like a dark wave as he sprinted down the aisle. Guests screamed, in confusion, chairs scraping against the floor as people stumbled out of his way. Emily's bouquet slipped from her hands. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. "What the hell is happening?" the groom shouted, his voice shaking with shock. Max barked again, lunging forward with such force that Emily nearly lost her grip on the leash. He wanted to chase, to drag the fleeing man down. His instincts were screaming louder than words ever could. Moments later, the wail of sirens cut through the chaos. Police cars screeched to a stop outside, and within seconds, officers burst through the doors, weapons drawn. "Where is he?" one barked. Emily pointed with a trembling hand toward the back exit. "He ran out." "The priest." "He's not a priest," the officer interrupted sharply. "That man is Victor Lane. He's a professional con artist and thief. He's wanted in 3 states for fraud, robbery, and impersonation. We got a tip he might be here, but we didn't expect this." Emily's stomach dropped, her head spinning. He was going to marry us." The officer glanced at the discarded ring box on the floor, his expression darkening. He knelt, opening it carefully, and froze. Hidden beneath the velvet lining was a thin sheet of foil concealing a folded passport and bundles of cash. He was planning to take off after this ceremony. The officer muttered grimly, probably had his next victim lined up. You were just another mark to him. Emily swayed, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. If Max hadn't barked, she would have signed her name on a marriage certificate with a criminal who never loved her, who only wanted her money. The officers rushed outside, and minutes later, they dragged the imposter back in handcuffs. His face was twisted with rage, but beneath that was something else: fear. Max snarled low, his hackles raised, teeth bared in silent warning. The man flinched away as the officers pushed him past the altar. One of the officers knelt and scratched Max behind the ears. "Smart dog," he said. "He saved you. Dogs always know." Emily collapsed to her knees, wrapping her arms around Max as tears streamed down her cheeks. "You're my hero," she whispered into his fur, her voice breaking with gratitude and love. Guests surrounded her, their murmurs a mix of shock and relief. Hours later, the wedding resumed quietly in a small side hall, stripped of grandeur but filled with genuine emotion. The new officiant's voice trembled slightly as he said the words, but this time there was no danger lurking behind the vows. Emily and her groom exchanged rings, their hands shaking, their eyes shining with the realization of how close they had come to disaster. Max lay at their feet, his tail wagging lazily. Now that the threat was gone, Emily kissed her husband and then bent to kiss her dog's head. "He didn't just save me from danger," she whispered softly. "You saved me from a life built on lies." As the celebration continued, Emily glanced at Max, her heart swelling with gratitude. People often spoke of soulmates and destiny, but that day, she learned something no one had ever told her. Sometimes, the guardian of your happiness isn't the man at the altar, it's the loyal friend who barks when something feels wrong. The church was silent except for the low hum of organ music echoing through the air. Candle flames flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the stone walls. It was an old place, steeped in history, the kind of building that felt alive with whispers of the past. Emily stood at the doorway, her white gown shimmering in the dim light, her heart racing as her father adjusted her veil. Today should have felt like a dream come true, but instead, a chill clung to the air, as if something unseen was watching. Beside her sat Max, her German shepherd, a black bow tie snug around his strong neck. Usually, his presence calmed her. Today, even Max seemed uneasy. His ears twitched constantly, and his sharp eyes darted toward the altar every few seconds. Emily bent down and stroked his fur. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, forcing a smile, but deep down, the knot in her stomach tightened. The organ music swelled, and Emily stepped forward. The guests rose, smiling, murmuring in awe as she walked down the aisle with her father and her dog. Max's paws clicked softly against the stone floor, his nails tapping like a warning no one could hear. At the altar stood her groom, his smile warm and steady, and behind him, the priest in his flowing robe, head slightly bowed, face obscured by the flickering candlelight. Emily's eyes lifted to meet his and froze. For a fraction of a second, she thought his eyes gleamed red, like embers in the dark. She blinked, and they looked normal again. She laughed softly to herself. Wedding nerves, she thought, nothing more. The vows began, the priest's voice echoing eerily against the stone walls. It was deep, commanding, like a voice that didn't belong to a man at all. The guests didn't seem to notice, their faces serene as they listened. Emily tried to focus on her groom, on the love in his eyes, but her skin prickled. With every word the priest spoke, "Do you, Emily, take this man?" "I do," she whispered, though her voice trembled. The priest turned to the groom, repeating the question. The answer came, firm and sure. "I do." The priest nodded slowly, then reached into the folds of his robe and withdrew a small silver tray holding the rings. That's when it happened. Max stiffened, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. His amber eyes blazed as he stared at the priest. Emily tugged his leash, panic flaring in her chest. "Max, stop," she whispered, but the dog ignored her. His growl deepened, echoing in the silence like a warning from another world. Then, with a suddenness that made everyone jump, Max barked loud and sharp, the sound bouncing off the stone walls. The candles flickered violently, as though a gust of wind had swept through the church. Guests gasped. The priest's hand jerked, and the silver tray clattered to the ground, the rings spinning across the floor. Like tiny golden suns, Emily's breath caught as the priest's face turned pale, deathly pale. For an instant, his features twisted into something inhuman, something monstrous, before flickering back like a glitch in reality. Then he did something no one expected. He ran with a shriek that sounded less like fear and more like rage. The priest bolted from the altar, his robe swirling behind him like black smoke. The guests screamed, stumbling out of his way as he lunged toward the massive wooden doors. Max lunged too, teeth bared, snarling with a ferocity Emily had never seen before. The leash burned her hand as she held on for dear life. "Stop him!" someone shouted, but no one moved. Everyone was frozen in shock as the priest slammed into the doors, which burst open with a crash loud enough to shake the ancient walls. A rush of icy wind swept through the church, snuffing out half the candles in an instant. Emily fell to her knees, gasping for breath. Her heart hammered in her chest as the guests erupted into chaos, voices rising in panic. Her groom pulled her close, shielding her as the doors swung violently in the wind. And then, silence, and unnatural silence that pressed against her ears. Moments later, the air crackled with energy, and the candles flickered back to life. A strange smell lingered, sulfur, faint but unmistakable. Emily's blood ran cold. She turned slowly toward the altar and saw the priest's robe crumpled on the floor like an empty shell. He was gone, completely gone. The guests whispered in terror, some crossing themselves, others clutching their rosaries. The groom's voice shook as he whispered, "What? What was that?" Emily didn't answer. Her gaze drifted to Max, who stood rigid, his chest heaving, teeth bared at the empty doorway. Slowly, his posture eased, but his eyes never left the spot where the priest had vanished. He barked one short, sharp, final, as if declaring the danger over. A man in uniform stepped forward from the crowd, a local historian Emily vaguely remembered inviting as a friend of her father. His voice trembled as he said that the thing was never a priest. This church is over 300 years old. There are legends about a man who made a deal with the devil, who betrayed his vows and cursed this ground. They say his spirit still roams, looking for a bride to take with him. Emily's heart stopped. She clutched Max's fur, her entire body shaking. If he hadn't barked, if he hadn't sensed it, would she have been that bride? The wedding was moved to a different hall later, stripped of grandeur, but filled with raw emotion. The vows were whispered, the rings exchanged with trembling hands. Max lay at her feet, calm now, his job done. Emily kissed her groom softly, then bent to press her lips against Max's head. "You didn't just save me," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "You saved my soul." That night, long after the celebration ended, Emily stood at her bedroom window, staring at the moonlit trees. Somewhere in the distance, a shadow moved, too fast, too silent, and then disappeared. She shivered and turned back to see Max curled on the rug, watching her with steady eyes. She smiled faintly, though fear still lingered in her bones. "They say vows are forever," she whispered to herself, "but so is loyalty. And thank God, yours was stronger."